Jesus would have called so many of his disciples to come and follow him. You know, another interesting fact that I was thinking about was that when I was a kid, I always thought the Sea of Galilee was this monstrous ocean in the middle of Israel. But after I came here, I realized that, don't get me wrong, it's still a really big body of water, but it's more like a really large lake than it would be a sea. For instance, if you stand from one shore, you can almost see all the other shores circling the lake. So actually getting from one side to the other would have been pretty easy. A quick boat ride. You know, kids, the Sea of Galilee is the location where many of God's miracles would have taken place. For instance, this is the lake where he walked on water. This is the lake where he calmed the storm to protect the disciples' lives. You know, I've even heard that today, from some of the local fishermen, that today there'll be a storm that will whip up out of nowhere. You know, it wouldn't have taken much for a small fishing boat back in the biblical times to be shaken back and forth, so much to the point where you would have feared for your life.
Once after a long session of teaching, Jesus and his disciples decided to cross the Sea of Galilee by boat. Jesus was tired and he fell asleep in the boat. While Jesus slept, a storm crashed down on them. The disciples were sure they would all drown. But when Jesus woke, he stood up and cried out and told the storm to stop. Immediately, the lake was calm. The disciples were completely shocked. What kind of man could command weather? No normal man could. Only a man with the power of God. Continued traveling all around the Galilee region. As Jesus was traveling with his disciples, they came through this area, Caesarea Philippi. As they were walking along the road, Jesus started to question his disciples. He said, "Who do you think that I am?" Peter didn't miss a beat. He said, "You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God." None of the other disciples disagreed. They were all certain that Jesus was the one that God sent to lead the Jewish people, the Messiah. From Caesarea Philippi, Jesus took 3 of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, into a high mountain, probably Mount Hermon. There, Jesus, he changed. His face and his clothes became as bright as the sun. 2 people appeared, Moses and the prophet Elijah, and talked with them. The 3 disciples were obviously stunned. I think anybody would be. Peter tried to speak. He began to ask Jesus if he could build 3 tents or booths. But as soon as he started to talk, he was interrupted. A voice from heaven said, "This is my beloved Son. Hear him." All 3 disciples fell to the ground and stayed there until only Jesus remained on the mountain with them. You know, the Galilee region is filled with large rolling hills. So one of the best things to do on a beautiful day is to go exploring. You never know what you might find. Come on, let's go. water.
Nice. Kids, look at this. It's a swimming hole in the Galilee. Look at these rocks. This whole thing is natural. It kind of looks like a curtain.
Man, I love swimming on hot days, especially here in the Galilee. Okay, so I was thinking about Jesus and the disciples on top of this mountain. It was kind of a weird response for Peter to start building a booth, right? I mean, what was he building a booth for in the first place? Well, if we go back and search the festival of Sukkot, it will all make a bit more sense.
Okay, so Sukkot is the festival of booths. It celebrates the time when God's presence dwelt with the Israelites at Mount Sinai. During this festival, each family will build a booth or a small tent and live in it, just like God lived in the tabernacle with the Israelites. Peter would have grown up celebrating Sukkot every year. To him, building a booth was simply a way to praise God for dwelling with them. When Peter saw Jesus transformed, he was certain that Jesus was the Messiah, that God had sent the one to dwell with the people again.
After this, Jesus began to make his way toward Jerusalem. The 12 disciples must have been sure that Jesus was going to Jerusalem to claim the throne of David. He must now be ready to start leading the kingdom of Israel. We're back in Jerusalem. Jesus had been in Jerusalem often and had passed through the city gates many times, but this time would be different. Jesus came near the city. He told his disciples to bring him a young donkey. He sat on the donkey and then rode into Jerusalem. Everybody there knew exactly what this meant. The Bible had said that the Messiah, the King, would ride into Jerusalem on a young donkey. To the crowds that began to gather, this was a sure sign that Jesus was about to take back the throne of Israel. The people began to shout, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord." The crowds were not the only ones that had been watching Jesus. Some of the Jewish leaders had also been watching, and unlike the disciples, they were not convinced that Jesus was the Messiah. They told Jesus to stop the crowds from shouting. In their minds, calling Jesus a simple carpenter from Nazareth, the King of Israel, would offend God and anger the Romans. But when Jesus was told to quiet the people, he refused.
Now, folks would come down on this street that I'm standing on to buy their lambs for the Passover feast. Jesus would have come back to Jerusalem to come and celebrate the Passover festival.
While Jesus was here, he continued teaching the people on these very steps. I can just imagine Jesus sitting here. As he taught here, Jesus was constantly being challenged by Jewish leaders. They would ask him questions that were meant to embarrass him. But every time Jesus responded, it was the Jewish leaders who felt embarrassed. This angered them, and they conspired against him. The week of the Passover feast was a very special time for the Jewish people. One of the first things Jesus and his disciples had to do was buy a lamb. Then, on a certain night of the week, they gathered together for the Passover dinner. My friend Gary Beyer has invited us over so we can see what this meal would have been like.
In Jesus' day, when the people arrived in Jerusalem to celebrate this feast, this was one of them, that they would go to Jerusalem. On their pilgrimage to do the feast, they would purchase a lamb. And then during the afternoon, before the observance of Passover, the heads of the household would bring the lambs to the temple courtyard, and there, in the presence of the priests, they would slay the lambs, and then return to their homes, the place where they were staying temporarily. And after sundown, the large families would gather together for the Passover celebration.
Gary told me that ever since the time of the first Passover, the Jewish people had been celebrating the same dinner each year. They would remind themselves about the first Passover. They would remember how the Israelites had been told to take a lamb and spread the blood on the doorpost of their homes. I asked Gary, why was the lamb so important? He told me that the lamb was the sacrifice that kept God's people safe from the angel of death in Egypt. And then he told me that the lamb was sacrificed every year to atone for the sins of the people. Just like when God had provided Abraham a ram for the sacrifice instead of Isaac. God would require a lamb to be sacrificed for each family. This had become the way to approach God's presence. Gary told me that the Passover would be a perfect time for the Messiah to become king, because it was the same time of the year that the people were remembering how Moses had delivered them out of the oppression of Egypt. As we celebrated our Passover meal, I couldn't help but think about the Passover meal Jesus had celebrated. It must have been a very exciting time. The disciples had just seen Jesus riding into Jerusalem with crowds cheering and worshiping God. I'm sure they expected Jesus to lead the people of Israel out of the oppression of Rome very soon.
After the Passover meal, Jesus and his disciples came to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. The disciples must have been wondering, what would Jesus do next?
He had entered Jerusalem like a king, but if he was going to lead Israel, what would happen to the Romans? Would the Messiah have to kick them out of Israel before he became king? And what about the Jewish leaders? The ones who didn't yet believe that Jesus was their Messiah. Wouldn't he have to prove to them that he was their Messiah before he became king? If Jesus was going to take the throne, now would have been the time to do it. After all, Passover was celebrated at a time when Moses first led the Israelites out of the oppression of Egypt. It would make sense for Jesus to lead the Jewish people out from the oppression of Rome during the festival of Passover. While Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, he was praying to his Father. Jesus seemed to be overwhelmed. He spent all night praying, crying out to his Father. The disciples couldn't stay awake. Even though they tried to stay up with Jesus and pray, one by one, they all fell asleep. Suddenly, they heard soldiers. The disciples ran. They were so scared that they would be arrested or killed. But Jesus did not run. He was arrested and led off to trial. Come back to see what would happen. They still thought that now Jesus would show those who didn't believe that he was their Messiah. But Jesus remained silent. Jesus was held in jail for a night. Likely, he would have spent it here. This is a cistern, a large tank that would have held water. Here, Jesus would have waited for the morning, possibly even in mud. His disciples also would have waited, hoping that maybe Jesus would have shown his power to claim the throne of David. Only the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, could condemn people to die. Jesus was accused of starting a rebellion against Rome. When Pontius Pilate heard this, decided that Jesus had to be killed. He would be crucified, nailed onto a cross. Crucifixion was cruel and horrible. The Roman soldiers whipped and beat Jesus. They then took him to a hill outside of the city. They pounded nails through his hands and through his feet into his cross. Dying from crucifixion can take a long time. Many of Jesus' followers, even Mary, his mother, saw him hanging there.
Maybe Jesus would come down off the cross and show who he really was. Maybe God would send the angels down. Or maybe God had waited specifically till the last second to rescue his Messiah. The same way he waited until the last second to save Isaac from Abraham's knife.
But none of this happened. Jesus stayed on the cross. He cried out in pain, asking why God had forsaken him. And then, finally, Jesus, God's own Messiah, David's heir, the one person all Israel had waited for since God first led their ancestor Abraham from his home, was dead.